And we will be today looking at some more paintings that I believe you tend to walk by quickly in a museum, some of which are seldom shown. But it is in laying out this whole series, it's dealing with the label this art goes under. It's just called academic painting because it's from the French Academy, from the whole French state-sponsored educational exhibition scheme, which was the main career path and source of livelihood for a lot of artists in France in the 19th century. We're looking at Bouguereau. There's something, you notice he has this lapel decoration. Well, that's of some significance. That's an award from the French Legion of Honor. So he's showing that he has done well. Rather than just looking at his picture, let's get his photograph, go back to some more works by him. Now, where'd that go? Here. And there he is in his somewhat later years, maybe 10, 15 years later, in one of the painting workshops that he headed in the parallel institution to the École des Beaux-Arts. This is the Académie Julienne, where students who were not, for whatever reason, admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts, generally because they could not afford it or because they could not pass the French exam, or there were two drawing contests. They might not make it through them. They would come to the academies, especially like the Académie Julienne, work like a dog at the subjects provided for them, which were essentially nude models, and that's what they craved. And last week, I didn't mention what else they did, because underneath that, you see there's this supposition that the most important thing to be able to paint is the human body. Subjects that have to do with humanity, the stories of humanity, whether it's religious stories, historical stories, or classical mythology. And also that it needs to be done in a representational, convincing manner. So that's the assumption underlying the whole educational system. So diligent students not only went and painted, and in the cigarette smoke fog of these crowded studios, where I read a little more, in that constant competitive atmosphere of these schools, there were weekly competitions for what subject, I don't know, that would determine how close you got to sit to the model. So week by week, you were jockeying for position, literally jockeying for position. Well, so in addition to seeing those models standing there for you, male or female for the men, mainly female or child for the women, the students would go to the nearby morgue and watch the dissections in the morgue. And then they would, like Bouguereau in particular, he would go to a costume institute and study clothing of other eras. So they are working to just acquire this great body of knowledge. I'm putting off showing one of his paintings for a second more. And back to one of those wonderful Daumier caricatures that were in a popular caricature magazine, the kind of work that he did primarily around the middle of the century, when he had been banned from doing anything in the political critical sphere. So he's taking well, I don't know if you'd call it benign look or not, at the contemporary Parisian scene. So you had this day of the opening of the annual salon. Once you studied, you would hope to have work that had the merit sought by the judges, who would then admit it into the annual salon, which was the great social and cultural event certainly in the visual arts in Paris annually. A couple of things I wanted this time. Well, I love looking at these, but to point out how this is reaching everybody. Look at the child, women, and then men of various degrees of interest in what's going on. And it is really wonderful the way look, even that sort of get the angle, the way he's looking down at his little booklet, they're giving him information on the paintings here. So this 6,000 people who showed up at the annual exhibition on the one opening day. So I want to say something about this crowd. And this is my pop psychologizing about this. That can be just like nonsensical, but I put it out there. I was thinking that one reason the kind of intensely what I was calling photorealistic style and classical or religious subject matter, which was favored by the judges, favored by the people who came to the salon, was that is also safely in the past, when this is a time when Paris and life in general was changing with just such velocity that people were not accustomed to. I mean, now that's a big cliche about how fast things change, but it had been, for centuries, a fairly agrarian, stable society. And now there's industry, the rise of the middle class. And I think the population of Paris doubled at least every 20 years. So, and nothing looked the same. You didn't see people, life was not the way it had been. So, and here's the one. The term modernity, that's a term that was invented in this period. So the whole sense of things being different and new, a completely different world, was everywhere. And if your desire was to find respite in what you looked at and to have some security in what you were doing, what could be better than to have paintings that you could judge whether they were good by how much they looked like real life, how much I could never do anything like that. How could they do that? As opposed to, all like the cliches, take Picasso or Helen Frankelthal, I just picked them out of there, my kid could do that, or they call that art. You had a standard, and you knew you could judge for yourself. It looks like life. It's amazing like life. It takes tremendous craft. You can't see any brushwork in these paintings. They are just impeccable, enameled finishes. How can they do that? And then the familiarity of themes, whether it's religious, historical, mythological, that had been the themes of former art espoused by the aristocracy that grew up conversant in a world of art. You could see that also would have an appeal to this new audience. And then there's something else about it, these sort of grander thoughts I had about this so-called academic art. Looking at them, it doesn't make any sense, I think, unless you were an extreme specialist, to say, this is a work from 1880, this is a work from 1860. The look of the work is static. These are not artists who are in their own field, pushing the frontiers, trying to do something new in any sense. So there's just this bedrock of a kind of familiarity. And since that's what the public wanted, artists who truly needed to make a career, who did not have the money from some other source to support them while they did as they pleased, but that wanted their public, this is what they stay with. So that's my apology for it. And I'm not, that's like apology in the sense of an explanation, but it's also an apology for looking at some of them. I did have several more Bouguereau paintings that I thought would be worth looking at. This one of a Pietà with so obviously mourning angels, the stoical mother, and then the image of Christ. Well, I dare say there are a number of people who are watching this, even if there are not very many people watching, saying, oh, I know where that comes from. The Christ smaller than the Mary, the thin legs, that the arm hanging down like that, the head thrown back. So this is not serving as a kind of an inspiration or solely as an inspiration for Bouguereau. This is there to bring out for everybody their recollection of Michelangelo and putting this painting in the grand heritage of the high Renaissance masters. Or this one, the Birth of Venus. In classical art, you're never going to find, from which the body type comes, you would never find a Venus with long hair, because in sculpture, this would be an extremely implausible addition and likely to break off in marble. So where does this come from? Well, you know where this comes from. This is Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which was just about exactly 400 years before this painting was done. So I know the myth of her birth is that she's blown to shore on the island of Crete, but I don't recall in the story that it says that she's on a shell. Might be, but I just don't recall that. But here, that would be another part that is taken from Botticelli. But what about all of these conch blowing sea creatures called tritons, and the women, they're nereids, and then the tumbling clouds of cherubs that do not represent angels. Where does that come from? Well, that's Raphael. The subject is different here. It's a triumph of Galatea, but it's another woman on a shell with the nereids and tritons and cupids around and down below. There's no artist that Bouguereau more admired than Raphael. And in fact, one thing he did when he was trying for that grand competition, the Prix de Rome, was to make a full-size replica of this, which is a fresco in Rome. So he completely eroticizes it in a new way. But she scarcely looks like a living woman. I find this one just really hard to bear. It's called the Nymph. It's in a museum in Stockton, California. I think this seems like hardly the thing you would find in Stockton, California. It's called the Nymphaeum. Well, nymphs are half deities in the Greek world, and they are sometimes associated with springs and grottos. And in fact, there's even a kind of classical building called a Nymphaeum, which was often a fountain house. But there's no myth behind this. What you do see is he's just transposed his Venus and the birth of Venus over here. And then he has all these others. And you can see, however, they are, well, I guess meant to be erotic. They are somehow also very unreal. So there's nothing really disquieting about them. Maybe her pose looks a little too casually real. But that's about all. As opposed to this by another academic artist, a man named Jerome. You'll be familiar with the work of his from the Met, a Pygmalion. I think one of these times it will show up. But it's women in a bath, in a Turkish bath in Bursa, Turkey. Well, anything from the Middle East was very exotic and very much enjoyed in the 19th century, partly because of the French acquisitions in that area. But you see, Jerome, when he does his nudes, they look more like real women. And he grounds this in a slightly more plausible world. As opposed to that, I will tell you that this painter, this academic painter, spelled Gerome, taught Thomas Eakins and Mary Cassatt when they came to Paris to study. And this painting, which makes me, I look at with fascination and horror. It's called the Youth of Bacchus, and Bacchus is the god of wine. It's 1884. It's 20 feet long, 11 feet high. It was in the Salon in the mid-1880s. Then it was shown in London, I believe, a few other places. Then it went back to Bouguereau's study, where it hung. Well, then in Hartford, Connecticut, there was an exhibition, I think it was in the 80s, when this was a Bouguereau's work. And it was brought over for that. But, so it's a very good classical subject, beloved of Renaissance and post-Renaissance artists, where Bacchus, the god of wine, here thoroughly and feasting, as you can see, too tipsy to be able to stay on his donkey, with two of his satyrs helping him stay on, and then the dancing, rejoicing nymphs and satyrs all around. Well, there are even Roman sarcophagi, stone coffins, that have this on the subject, because it was about a theme of life and life after death. So there was, for the ancients, a possible deeper meaning to it, but by the Renaissance, no, it was just a favorite classical subject. Why am I showing you this? These two paintings are contemporaries. When Seurat is painting the Sunday afternoon at La Grande Jatte, Bouguereau is doing this. And then also, because I needed to share something else about this, it was up for sale in Sotheby's just before COVID. I haven't found any information to tell me that it's sold, but here is what was written by the American director of Sotheby's in the pre-show catalog when they're wanting to get business to sell this. Mind you, it was in a show that otherwise was impressionist, and let's see, what else was it? Impressionist and modern art. And well, this is neither Impressionist nor modern, but the director of the Sotheby's said he wanted to make sure that the world's wealthiest buyers have access to it, so that the show where those buyers would show up is where he wanted this to be seen. And this is how he tried to convince people about the worthiness of this. I remember so clearly when I first saw the Youth of Bacchus at the Wadsworth Athenaum in 1985 that I was struck by the size of this great painting, but I was enamored with the lifelike quality of the figures. Technically brilliant, each figure seems to have its own unique personality. Seeing the painting in Bouguereau's studio, hanging on the very wall where he painted it, was an emotional experience for me. I was attracted once again by the magnetic presence of the central group of dancing figures. Indeed, for a few seconds, I felt they were dancing in front of the painting, as if the painting were three-dimensional. When you see the true majestic scale and technical brilliance of this masterpiece, you realize this is one of the greatest pictures painted in the 19th century. Its appearance on the market, something I would have only dreamed of back in 1985, will present a truly singular opportunity to acquire a work that is the last and greatest of its kind. Now that's the language that the very first dealers, since dealing in art was also an innovation in the mid-19th century, were using to sell paintings like this. I just brought a couple in from the Sotheby's site. Here they are, carefully unrolling it. Of course, the advantage of a painting on canvas is that it can be taken from its frame and then more easily, travels more easily, although still was quite a challenge. As here they're erecting it. This is the part that you saw being unrolled. Bouguereau painted all of this himself, no assistance. One of the laudable, fine features of this man comes through in something else he'd said to probably a critic rather than a friend, that every day he went to his studio and he was saddened when it started to get too dark to paint at night, and he could hardly wait to get back to his studio in the morning. I mean, he loved what he did. So this would say be, this is a painting by Titian of here's a figure like Bacchus, whether it's probably is meant to be Bacchus here, of these dancing groups of nymphs and satyrs. And just one very provocative woman. And this is an engraving made after a painting by Rubens, where you see that immensely corpulent satyr just practically breaking the back of the donkey on which he rides, so that here an assistant helps to carry him, and the dancing and rejoicing and cavorting all around them. So Bouguereau is again taking something that has a very fine pedigree. This is still even sort of arranged like a Renaissance painting. It's very clear, sort of divided, this main group in the center here. It's actually rather discreet to put this drunken, obese fellow in the background so that you can look mainly at the young, healthy, dancing figures in the foreground. He's not too much interested in distance. It's just very hazy. This is almost like a stage backdrop. And that makes it look more like a relief sculpture. And that actually, relief sculpture was a source for a lot of the thinking about how you arrange a composition. It shouldn't go way back. It should be just run across the surface like this. Don't you think if that model for this figure walked by your window, you would recognize her? So he had all these classical subjects, but he's not limited to that. This one is just called, well, let's see, I'm not sure it's called. It's just called Charity. So I know you can just, when you think of Victorian taste, Victorian sentimentality, Victorian Valentines, figures of these sort of sweet young children like this, healthy, even if this is meant to be a gypsy family or a very poor family, but it has a very Victorian cast to it. It's not very plausible. It would hardly arouse a person, I believe, with a skeptical frame of mind, to think that you wanted to increase your almsgiving. They are extremely clean. Their clothes are clean, if tousled. That's a very well-fed youngster there. And the emotion, as we look at it from a modern point of view, is just so posed. People would be able to recognize that this was in front of a particular Parisian church. So that gives that this little whiff of actuality, although these figures in themselves look realistic, but they look like figures who've been posed. Again, it has a reference to art. 17th century great French artist Poussin, with this kind of triangular setting, the Holy Family on a stairway. So there's, again, he's bringing in those references that people would be likely to, some people would recognize. Then the two that are at the Met. This one of a woman and her child. It's just called Mother and Child. It was bought by a dealer from Bouguereau's study and from his studio, and then it was bought by an American. Americans would buy anything that was French. They were equally enthusiastic about Impressionist paintings and these paintings. There are quantities of similar works. Again, a humble setting of figures who then in themselves are posed in the setting. But lovely, charming. I mean that truly. Look at that soft, feathery hair, the gleam of the beads, the adoring affection of the mother, the obedient interest in us of the child. They're also a Breton brother and sister. So he had models come to his studio, and then these costumes from the peasants from Normandy, the area where Gauguin will go first to study people who are outside the city sphere. So he had them pose for him. I found this quite disconcerting when I see it in reality, is to have her foot sticking out like that for me. But he did quantities of paintings like this. This one's called The Nut Gatherers. Are these girls who are really having to labor? Are these true peasants? No. Washerwomen. I'm partly making a point of this because we will come back to peasants who are shown as peasants later on. And then a main source of income for most of these academic art, or many of them anyway, was portraiture. And not many of those will necessarily show up in the market because they're still often owned by the families from which the sitters came. This is a very charming one he did of a girl, what's her first name? Gabrielle Cot, C-O-T. It's an indication of the esteem in which Bouguereau was held, because her father was the painter who did this one that's in the Met. It's called The Storm. And this one was commissioned by an American painter, American wealthy woman. This one is a 3 and 12-year-old Johnson girls. It was commissioned by a member of the family of an American railroad tycoon who happened to be the first president of the Metropolitan Museum. So that's the level of people who were appreciating and buying these works. There are many, many paintings we'll also see in Cassatt, especially of girls reading, because as literacy was increasing and as women were increasingly allowed to read, it becomes a sort of like a key, well, sort of signifier of value and progress and care on the part of the parents. And this one, this is a portrait of Mademoiselle Elizabeth Gardner. Now, that portrait in itself is not significant, but the woman is. She was one of the early female Americans to go to France independently. Actually, she went in 1864, so she went right at the time of the Civil War and established a career there. She, in fact, ultimately marries Bouguereau. Now, I wonder, there are not, and here's an early photograph of her. I want to talk about her rather than her art, because her art is something that doesn't even appear very often that I can get images of it, because although she was highly esteemed in her day, now there's not much attention paid. So she came from New Hampshire, from a mercantile family. No woman would be allowed to travel by herself or to be out in public by herself yet in the mid-19th century. So she went to Paris with someone who had been her drawing teacher when she was in school. And they found an apartment in Paris. Elizabeth immediately tried to apply to the École des Beaux-Arts. You already know this. She evidently did not. No women were allowed. She would try to apply to one of those academies. At that time, no women were allowed. So she had short hair at the time because she'd had a fever, evidently, before they embarked on this trip. So she had short hair, and she went to the police and she got permission to wear pants. So she could dress as a boy, and that way she enrolled in the Gobelin Tapestry School of Drawing, because the people who presented, made this imagery for the tapestries had to be able to draw. So she had her first education that way. Now, that is a woman of considerable resource and enterprise. And then when the Académie Julienne opened up to women, she was one of the first 3 to get in, and she then studied with Bouguereau. Bouguereau's wife died. And they started a liaison that went on for 17 years, was known by all the artists in the area. I mean, they were perfectly upfront about this. It was because Bouguereau's mother was so violently opposed to this second marriage. And one of Bouguereau's daughters had said, I think it was that she would kill herself if he remarried. They waited until Bouguereau's mother died. So she was 59 and he was 71 when finally they married. But she also had not wanted to marry right away because she wanted to establish the career in her own right, not just because she was the wife of Bouguereau. She worked in the sort of, she spoke French, Italian, German, and English. She wrote articles home for a newspaper in Boston and a newspaper in Cincinnati. She, from the beginning, to earn money while she was there, had commissions from Americans who wanted copies from paintings in the Louvre. Remember, that's how women often first had careers. And then those patrons she introduced to Bouguereau. Sometimes they got portraits of themselves from him. And then she began to advise Americans who came to Paris in the academic circle, who are the artists who are good. And then, so she was a very canny, very good businesswoman. Her art was aiming at selling. And there's a quote from her after Bouguereau had died, late in her life, when women artists were quite well accepted, 1910, I think this was. She said, well, I've often been criticized for not being sort of more expressive of herself. But she said, I would rather be a copyist of Bouguereau than be a nobody. So she very much had career in her mind. This is a painting she did that's in the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. from about 1895. And an American, a woman who visited her studio, just bought it right from the studio. So it's the biblical David, not in a particularly heroic position here. I mean, the part of the story, it's not with Goliath, but it is biblically based from a passage in Samuel when David says, well, he's even killed lions to protect the sheep. So here it said, this would be David looking up as if he's thanking the Lord for the sheep that he has saved from the jaws of that lion. There is something she wrote about related to this painting that also tells more about not just her personality, but this has to have been the attitude of very many of these artists who are trying so much to establish their careers in this field that was opening up, however, gradually to them. She said she thought this painting, the subject wasn't a good paying investment. She says it's probably too serious for ordinary tastes, but it might be good for a museum. So she's painting with her audience in mind. This is not self-generated out of a desire to express herself. Or this one called Maternity. Well, this is like the other era in art where ordinary life and the life of peasantry was fascinating to people, and that was in the 17th century Holland, which likewise had a broadly but not highly educated public merchant class. So there is just possibly something about this having an appeal to them. And this one, The Farmer's Daughter. Well, this was in the salon and she got a gold medal for this. This was the first, let me see, I think she's the first woman who ever won that medal. I'd probably, we're always interested in first. I have a hesitation about that from what we're going to look at in a minute. But So it's again this barefoot and charming and well-fed and extremely clean young peasant girl, actually based on an event when she and Bouguereau were caught in a storm on a farm, and she saw this girl. And that's all the paintings I brought in from her. And we do look at one other woman, just 15 years older than her, Rosa Bonheur. Let me see in an early photograph here. Next Tuesday, a retrospective of her work opens at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. It'll be the first retrospective ever of her work. I think it goes into mid-January, possibly a little later than that. So if you are lucky enough to be going to France soon, it would be interesting to see. I think they have something like 200 works by her. But in the preliminary publications for this retrospective, the person writing from Musée d'Orsay just happened to insert one fact that's alerting. Her paintings brought in more money than any other artist in the 19th century. She was adored, and images of her even appeared in advertising. So she was a star. It is partly, well, almost wholly because of what she chose to paint. But first, let me tell you a little more about her, and then she's completely outside the norms. Here she has a dress. For certain occasions, she would wear a dress, but she also went to the police and had permission to wear trousers because of the public outdoor setting where she did her most famous work that we'll look at in a moment. But she chose to wear trousers most of the time. And she smoked cigars rather than cigarettes. And she was openly lesbian. And she said, well, my personal life is just mine. It's not anybody else's affair. So she was extraordinarily independent and extraordinarily talented, and from an extraordinary family from Bordeaux. Her father was a painter. He did landscapes and I think portraits. Then there are 4 children. Rosa, who's animal painter par excellence. She had a brother and a sister who were both animal painters, and another brother who was an animal sculptor. So there's just this amazing constellation in one family. And she was an amazing and unusual person, even as a little kid. Evidently, unruly as all get out, expelled from school after school, which is very unusual for a young woman. Had a terrible time learning how to read and write, especially writing. Just could not learn to read, could not write, until her mother figured out a stratagem that worked. She told Rosa for each letter of the alphabet to think of an animal, draw that animal, and always associate that with that letter of the alphabet. So it sounds like something like with Temple Grandin, just a workaround from conventional way of learning. And she did not attend, although the family moved to Paris before 1830. That'd be far too early for her to follow up the career ladder by going to one of these academies and not to the école. But her father was able to teach her, and the sort of the formula she follows for learning with her father's guidance is just what was going on in the école. Although she didn't draw nudes, she drew animals, starting first of all with drawing lithographs of animals, then drawing plaster casts of animals. You know, that's how it was in the École des Beaux-Arts. You start by drawing copies of paintings, then you draw plaster casts, and then you could draw from the life when models. nude models primarily. Well, so she drew models of all animals. This is shortly before her death, a portrait of her. And you notice here, she also won the Legion of Honor medal for her work. Famous internationally, well, primarily England, US, and France, not so much in Germany. This painting was made by a young American woman who had studied for a while in Paris, then was doing portraits in Boston, and wrote Rosa Bonheur, could she come back and do her portrait, which she did. Rosa's partner of 40 years had died by that time, and this young woman, Anna Klumpke, then became her companion for the rest of her life. So this has a kind of a great idealizing quality to you, as you can see in the treatment of her face compared to this more rugged appearance there. So everybody who's been to the Met, I'm sure, knows her most famous work. That's this horse fair. And the date for that is, well, she worked on it she went twice a week to the horse market in Paris to draw there. And the painting itself, she worked on for about 2 years. It was exhibited, and then she put some finishing touches on it later than that. But it was accepted in the salon, no problem, in 1853. So it's about 16 and a half feet long and 8 feet high. This is all her work. So this is what a man would do. She didn't have much respect for men as being any greater than any woman. So this, this is from a time when still the horses were before there were any other means of locomotion. So the horses were mattered, and these were Percherons, big workhorses. And in these market fairs, their handlers would take them around in a circle. So people would be sitting up on an embankment here and watching them to see which ones they wanted to buy. So it's a scene from real life. And she is going to be called, because you have to find a label, a realist painter. And she does represent what is then something we're going to look at from now on for a while. A realist artist. We're out of the academic, primarily out of the academic classical mode. So here are just a couple of the many sketches she did for this, going again and again and again. These are 2 sketches that are owned by the Met. I think, no, let me look again. Yes, it's a kind of a sign of how extraordinarily popular her work was. This was bought for the Met in 1887. Now, the Met was less than 10 years old. It had a very small collection still. And Gloria Vanderbilt family bought this. They're very interested in racing too. So it's a scene from life, but it's also a scene that draws on art. And in fact, Rosa said, "This is my Parthenon frieze." So she frames it in that linkage, that mental linkage with classical art. But for this, you need know nothing about classical mythology. You don't need to know anything about history. You don't have to know anything about Christianity. You simply need to look at the world around you, especially the animal world that, as people are moving into the cities, seems more and more precious to them. So her innate interest exactly fits the social interest of this time. And she was well aware, after all, she'd been copying in the Louvre, of earlier 19th century paintings and English paintings also of animals. This is by an artist named Géricault, one of the first really romantic artists. This is troops, I think it's supposed to be from Napoleon's troops, with this great rearing horse. I just plucked these out for examples. Or Delacroix did so many with animals, lions, horses, and this is one of his with horses. And this one, neither one of these neither of these came from the Louvre, but there would be examples in the Louvre that she would have studied. So she saw all those works as well. And I thought, rather than just look at it for the subject and the realism of the subject, even down to the cobbles in the manure on the street here, look at it as a composition. I mean, what makes this a work of art? Because it's not exactly photorealism. First of all, it looks still as if you have like a frieze, like the Parthenon frieze, mainly this long, low composition with things spread across it. So how does she keep that interesting? Well, she shows that the setting is on an angle. The horses aren't. They go across parallel to the front of the picture. But you see the slant up here. So it suggests something goes way back in depth, and there are recognizable buildings that locate the fair where it belongs, here. And she plays up the contrast of dark and light, which was what was typical of the Romantic phase in art, that extremely dramatic element. Horse expressing its temperament here at its greatest. And these men, powerfully shouldered, working with their animals, have the detail. It will not be so clear in the detail, but it's probably her own self-portrait right here. Unlikely that all the men who worked there were as virile, as handsome as these guys are. So there is an undercurrent still of both romantic and idealizing art. Would be accepted. And there, this would be her portrait. That was not the first work she'd done that brought attention to her skills. She'd actually been commissioned by the French government to produce a painting that was to go to a museum in Lyon. And it's called, this is plowing in the area of Nevers, Nevers. It's central France. And this she did 1849. This one's not so big. It's 8.5 feet long. She produced this painting, and its quality was recognized as being so exceptional that it was not sent to the provincial museum, but put in what was used at that time as a museum of contemporary art in Paris. And it won a medal, not a gold medal, but it won a medal in the Salon in 1849. So she wins this recognition instantly for what she does. Again, you can pay attention to the composition, how much you get the sense of enhancing the sense of this labor. I don't know what these unks are doing, are turning the soil in the fall, so it's aerating it so for the crops in the spring. So it's just traditional fall activity, but rather than being on flat land, it's on a hill, and it's coming in our direction, since we always read paintings left to right. So you have this sense, increases the sense of this is effort up, up, up toward us. An immensity of sky up above. And then for the angle of the hill here, you have a countervailing about same angle in his stick there. These colors picked up here. So there is art and some degree of artifice. And there is also a quality to this subject that probably made it, well, one reason that the government would have commissioned her to do this. This was shown the year after there had been a revolution, the first of the 1848 revolutions. And one of the French segments of society that had been particularly in revolt were the peasants. And that was a great threat to the new urban middle class. So this was one that presents that, it frames it as the peasants are noble. This is noble labor for all of France. And it skirts around the whole issue of industry, shop owners, long hours in indoor jobs. And it seemed also to relate to a novel by George Sand, which was a very popular novel at that time. Another woman who at least took a man's name as her pen name. A wonderful sympathy for the animals. I might show you one or two next time, but we have 3 minutes, it looks to me. Those aren't so particularly significant. I will tell you something maybe related to this. The horse fair was taken to England to be exhibited. It so captured the fancy of Queen Victoria that she asked that when Rosa Bonheur came to the British Isles, that she asked to meet her. So the two of them had a conversation. And Rosa Bonheur also was actually a kind of a friend of the wife of the Napoleon III of France. So she was just outside all norms. Then she went up to Scotland and did a lot of work in Scotland. And I think this is one that she painted in Scotland. She never came to the US, but she's very interested in the Wild West. And in the Middle East. She, with the wealth she got from her paintings by 1855, already had made enough to buy a very grand chateau and grounds that's not far from Fontainebleau. And she had all kinds of animals there. And this is her pet lion, Fatma. Yes, I had to be sure you saw this. This is my beloved Tutu, her favorite Yorkie. This painting appeared on so many French postcards, on so many candy boxes, on so many everywhere. And this particular little image is the inspiration for Toto in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Because Frank Baum, who wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900, had seen this painting. And that's where the idea came from. So that's your reward for also plowing through the academic paintings. And next week, here we go. She did one of Buffalo Bill Cody. The Wild West Company came to Paris, and she looked at all the animals and met him, made friends with him. So next time we're getting into more familiar territory. And work that just shocked everybody so thoroughly, although still human picture rather than just beguiling animals. Not at all academic. So that's going to be Courbet's work, and all next hour will be on Courbet. So we stop now, and of course, questions, comments, and I ask, does anybody want me to go back to any of these before I turn off the slide share? No. Okay.
I'd just like to thank you very much, Maggie. It was wonderful.
You're welcome.
Yep.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you. I look forward to it every week.
Yeah, next
Thank you.
will be more familiar things, probably.
Thanks, Maggie.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much.
Lovely.
Could you just repeat the name of the last artist?
Yeah.
Bonnier.
No,
Bonnier.
the one that we're just going to get next week.
No, the lesbian.
Okay.
Rosa Bonnier.
Bonheur.
H-E-I-R. Oh, H-E-U-R.
Thank you, Maggie.
You're welcome.